Hello, hello. Just testing here. Start reading here. It's going to be a short one. Start reading here. It's going to be a short one. I can adjust the balance 1 second. Test. Test. Okay, there we go. So today we're going to be reading Enzo Traverso. It's a little bit old. Enzo Traverso, essay, article they wrote, called Post-Fascism. Fascism is a TransHistorical Concept. I'm going to try to read everything here. I already read part of it, and I found it really interesting, and I thought, why not force myself to read out loud, work on that, help me focus a little bit, and then, yeah. Got a little bit of the Duke playing in the background. Not sure what that means for the VOD, but the abstract is, what does fascism mean at the beginning of the 21st century? The word conjures a dark interwar landscape of violence, dictatorship, and genocide. Such images spontaneously return to our thoughts as we again see the rise of the radical right on a global scale, from Europe to the US and Brazil. Yet, fascism has changed its skin. It ostentatiously exhibits typical fascist features: authoritarian and charismatic leadership, hatred of democracy, contempt of law, derision of human rights, open racism, notably against blacks, Latinos, and Muslims, misogynism, homophobia. But the old fascist rhetoric has been abandoned. To the post-fascist movements depict themselves as defenders of national identities threatened by globalization, mass immigration, and Islamic fundamentalism. A hybrid phenomena, this post-fascism, is neither the reproduction of the old fascism nor something wholly new. It remains in suspension between an unknown future and a haunting past. And then we can get to the body of the article. In recent times, fascism has exceeded the boundaries of historiographical debate, where many observers thought it had been definitely relegated and spectacularly came back to the political agenda. The tendency is global. Since the 1930s, the world has not experienced a similar growth of radical right-wing movements, which inevitably awake the memory of fascism. At the beginning, the phenomenon appeared in continental Europe, with the rise of the Front National in France and the other far-right movements in the countries of the former Soviet bloc. Today, far-right parties are strongly represented in almost all European Union countries, sometimes as governmental forces. The success of Alternative für Deutschland and Vox show that Germany and Spain are no longer exceptions. In the most recent years, the wave became a tsunami and overflowed other continents. With the election of Donald Trump in the United States, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Narendra Modi in India, and Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. Nationalism, racism, xenophobia, and authoritarianism have become highly contagious. Everywhere, the ghosts of fascism reappear and reopen old debates. Are we coming back to the 1930s? Does the concept of fascism capture the novelty of our situation? As Reinhard Koselleck reminded us, there is a tension between historical facts and their linguistic transcription. This does not only mean that the concepts are indispensable in order to think a historical experience. This does not only mean that concepts are indispensable in order to think a historical experience. This also means that they can transcend it and be used in order to apprehend new realities, which are connected to the past through a web of memorial continuity. Historical comparisons, fascism is one of the privileged realms, come out from this tension between history and language. They are often extremely fruitful, but they establish analogies and differences rather than homologies and repetitions. Sometimes they reveal that old concepts no longer work and have to be renewed. Today, this entanglement between past and present displays an ambiguous semantics. On the one hand, almost nobody openly endorses fascism. Bolsonaro is the exception that confirms the rule, and most observers recognize the differences existing between the movements of the radical right and their ancestors of the 1930s. On the other hand, any attempt to define this new phenomenon implies comparison with interwar years. In short, the concept of fascism seems both inappropriate and indispensable for grasping this new reality. This is why I prefer to speak of post-fascism, a definition that emphasizes a chronological distance and locates what is happening today in a historical sequence shaped by both continuity and transformation. Chronologically, this right-wing constellation comes after a classical fascism and belongs to a different historical context. Politically, it cannot be defined without being compared to classical fascism, which remains a foundational experience. On the one hand, it is no longer fascism. On the other, it is not completely different. It is something in between. The concept of post-fascism certainly does not answer all answer all open questions, but corresponds to this transitional step. Control the delay.
In a sentimental mood, I can see the stars come through my room.
I'm good, since I actually don't have it enabled. It just feels like I do.
Is like a flame that lights the gloom on the wings.
Just chatting to myself. Okay.
Drifts the melody so strange and sweet in this sentimental bliss. You make my paradise complete.
We should not forget that the category of fascism has been frequently used after the Second World War. In 1959, Theodor Adorno wrote that the survival of National Socialism within democracy was potentially more dangerous than the survival of fascist tendencies against democracy. In 1974, Pier Paolo Pasolini depicted the anthropological models of neoliberal capitalism, at that time still embryonic, as a new fascism, in front of which the regime of Mussolini appeared irredeemably archaic, as a kind of paleo-fascism. With similar arguments, Umberto Eco spoke of Ur-fascism. And 10 years ago, many historians who tried to interpret Berlusconi's Italy recognized its intimacy, if not its affiliation with classical fascism. Of course, there were enormous differences between the founder of a totalitarian state and a successful businessman who owned several TV channels. But Berlusconi's plebiscite... Oh my god. Let me just quickly figure out how to pronounce this for everyone. Plebiscitary. Okay. I'm probably going to need this a bit. But Berlusconi's plebiscitary conception of democracy and charismatic leadership strongly evoked the fascist archetype, and Berlusconi was a modest forerunner of Donald Trump. Therefore, fascism is not only transnational or transatlantic, according to Federico Finkelstein, a historian of Argentinian fascism, but that it is also transhistorical. It is a collective memory that establishes a link between a concept and its public use, which inevitably exceeds a purely historiographical dimension. In fact, this is true for many of the concepts in our political lexicon. Saying that the United States, the Federal Republic of Germany, and France are democracies does not mean to posit the identity of their political systems. Neither to pretend that they would correspond to the Athenian democracy of Pericles' age. In the... Look this one up too. How do we say this?
Pericles'
Pericles' age, okay. In the 21st century, fascism will neither take the face of Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco, nor hopefully the form of totalitarian terror. But there are many ways to destroy democracy. The ritual reference to the threats of democracy, barbarians at the gate, a trope hammered by all the media since the emergence of Islamic terrorism, forgets a fundamental lesson of the history of fascism. Democracy can also be destroyed from within. The rise of the radical right is not the only analogy that we can make within the situation. Sorry, we're going to start from here. The vibes are too good. The rise of the radical right is not the only analogy that we can make with the situation between the two world wars. Other similarities are evident and have frequently been emphasized, from the lack of an international order to concentric waves of the economic crisis of 2008. The global chaos of the 1920s and 30s depended on the collapse of the 19th century European concert, whereas nowadays it results from the end of the Cold War and its bipolar world. As we know, international instability always raises the demand for strongmen. Sometimes the entanglement of crisis and instability produces events that turn into tragic repetitions. Think of the refugee crisis of 2015, which recalls of the Evian Conference of 1938, when Western democracies concluded that they would not receive the Jews who fled from Nazi Germany. Fucking heavy stuff. These parallelisms are significant, but they intertwine with some crucial differences that complexify and problematize the comparison. In this talk, I would like to stress that the most relevant of them. Violence, anti-communism, utopianism, racism, and the attitude of the economic and political elites. Okay, so violence. The first difference is obvious, but this is not a good reason either to ignore or to overemphasize it. Violence was central in both the ideology and practice of classical fascism. It was a product of the brutalization of continental Europe during the Great War. Speaking with George L. Moss, war shaped the realm of politics by transforming its language and its means of action. In many countries, especially those that had been defeated, the state monopoly of legitimate violence had been radically put into question and politics had taken arms. Many parties created their own militia. Today, on the opposite, most radical right leaders are accustomed to appearing on our television screens. They no longer inflame hysteric crowds or attend mass rallies in which their followers march dressed in uniform. Amongst their activists, violence is the exception, like the Utoya massacre of 2011 or the Charlottesville car attack 6 years later, not the rule. Post-Fascism has emerged after 70 years of peace in most Western countries. Thereafter, its relationships with democracy is different, and it does not exhibit a subversive character. The West was able to export violence outside of its borders, mostly in the Middle East, and is accustomed to depict one of its creatures, terrorism, as an external threat. But this is a form of exorcism. Anti-communism. A fundamental pillar of classical fascism was anti-communism. After the Great War, anti-communism was the crucible for the transformation of nationalism from conservative to a revolutionary right. Mussolini defined his movement as the revolution against revolution. Today, after the collapse of real socialism and the end of the USSR, anti-communism has lost both its appeal and its meaning. Sometimes it survives. Think of Bolsonaro's campaign against cultural Marxism, but has become a marginal. This has some considerable consequences. A powerful boundary that in the past separated fascism from laboring classes no longer exists. Thus, Le Pen, Salvini, Orban, and Trump have reintegrated the working class into a nationalist imagination. Of course, they refer to a national working class, one without migrants. Mostly composed of white men, but they would pretend to defend them against globalization. They claim a kind of ethnically circumscribed welfare state opposed to neoliberal policy of privatization. Let's go again. Okay, so they claim a kind of ethnically circumscribed welfare state opposed to neoliberal policy of privatization. A significant obstacle has fallen down. In historical perspective, post-fascism could also be seen as the result of the defeat of the revolutions of the 20th century. After the collapse of communism and the embrace of neoliberal reason by most social democratic parties, a radical right movements have become in many countries the most influential forces opposed to the establishment. Without showing a subversive face and avoiding any competition with a demobilized left. This change is far from being anecdotal. In the 1930s, fascism was unable to conquer the laboring classes, which had remained pervaded by a socialist culture and organized by left-wing parties and unions. A solid wall separated their values, identities, and languages. They expressed different rituals and symbols. When it came to power, fascism could not integrate the labor movement into its own social and political system. It was compelled to destroy it. Today, this cleavage has disappeared. In many European countries, the former bastions of the left have become with a spectacular reversal of the traditional electoral landscape, the strongholds of far-right parties. The radical claims the classic populist paradigm of good people opposed to corrupt elites, but has significantly reformulated it. Mission failed. We'll get him again next time. Let's start again. The radical right claims that the classic populist paradigm of the good people opposed to the corrupted elites, but has significantly reformulated it. In the past, the good people meant an ethnically homogeneous rural community opposed to the dangerous classes of the big cities. After the end of communism, a defeated working class struck by deindustrialization has been reintegrated in this virtuous national community. The bad people of post-fascist imagination, immigrants, Muslims, and blacks of the suburbs, veiled women, junkies, and marginal men, are merged with the leisure classes that adapt liberated customs, feminists, LGBTQ, anti-racist, ecologists, and defenders of immigrant rights. On the opposite spectrum, the good people are the nationalists, anti-feminists, homophobic, xenophobic, and nourish a clear hostility towards ecology, modern arts, and intellectualism. Anti-utopianism. Post-fascism belongs to a post-ideological age shaped by the collapse of the hopes of the 20th century, and it does not break a new regime of temporality, which, speaking once again with Koselleck, is deprived of any horizon of expectation. In the 1930s, fascism claimed a national revolution and depicted itself as an alternative civilization opposed to both liberalism and communism. It announced the birth of a new man who would have regenerated the continent by replacing the old and decadent democracies. Halfway there. On the contrary, post-fascism does not have utopian ambitions. Its modernity lies in the means of its propaganda. All its leaders are familiar with television, advertising, and communication, rather than in its project, which is deeply conservative, against the enemies of civilization, globalization, immigration, Islam, terrorism. The radical right only claims to return to the past, national currency, national sovereignty, and national preference, stopping immigration and the preservation of Christian roots of Western countries, gender hierarchies, and defense of families, etc. From this point of view, the new radical right is more neoconservative than fascist. It belongs to the tradition of cultural despair, the Kulturpessimismus, described by Fritz Stern, rather than to conservative revolution, which projected aristocrats and anti-democratic values into a future political order, a particular mix of obscurantism. Let's figure out how to say this one. I feel like I'm learning English again.
Obscurantism.
Oh, that's
Obscurantism.
obscurantism. Alright, fucking... Thank you, Google. An idealized technology. Think of the ideologue of Alternative für Deutschland, Rolf Peter Sieferle. He wrote a pessimistic pamphlet in which he complained about the decadence of Germany, dominated by cosmopolitan and post-national values, and completely reshaped by Habermas's idea of constitutional patriotism. After publishing his intellectual testament, Finis Germania, he committed suicide. In short, this is not the trajectory of a redeemer. He reminds once more of the resigned discourse on the decadence elaborated by Arthur Gobineau and Oswald Spengler in the 19th and early 20th centuries, rather than the modern call for revenge and regeneration embodied by Maurice Barres and Ernst Jünger and the thinkers of thinkers of integral nationalism, total mobilization, and the advent of the era of new militiamen. Their anti-modernism is antipodal to the proclivity of aestheticizing of politics, so typical of classical fascism. What the fuck does this mean? So it's like anti-polar. Okay. Polar opposite, antipodal. Now I know. In fact, there is a striking symmetry between the lack of futurity in both post-fascism and radical left culture. The eclipse of the myth of a 1,000-year Reich, or the rebirth of the Roman Empire, corresponds to the end of the socialist utopia. There is no equivalent today to the competition between Bolshevism and fascism to conquer the future that so deeply shaped the 1930s. This competition, which, according to Ernst Bloch, took place in the unconscious and in the dreams of the masses, belongs to the first half of the past century, whereas many of the left-wing movements like Occupy Wall Street in the US, 15M in Spain, or La Nuit debout in France, tried to build a new project for the future, post-fascism. Okay. New project for the future. Post-fascism fills the vacuum less by a disappeared horizon of expectation, with a reactionary retreat into the past. I think this is actually quite insightful right here. Alright, so xenophobia. Xenophobia or xenophobia? Only one way to find out.
Xenophobia.
Okay, so xenophobia. Can I switch between like UK and American? Hate to sound like a Brit. Alright, there's a great example of xenophobia. A common feature of the radical right is xenophobia. A hatred of immigrants shapes their ideology and inspires their action. They transform immigrants into infiltrated enemies, foreign bodies that threat to the health of the national community. I feel like we see this happening quite apparently with Trump right now. Globalization has engendered a series of powerful reactions, very diverse and often antipodal. Out of all of them, post-fascism is certainly the most regressive, a revival of ethnic nationalism. It rejects cultural pluralism in the name of monolithic identities and disclaims cultural, racial, or religious pluralism. It transforms George Simmels's paradigm of the stranger into Carl Schmitt's figure of the enemy. The search for a scapegoat is a constitutive element of fascist discourse, and post-fascism does not divert from this path, but it is an innovator more than a follower. The main targets of its hate are no longer the Jews, rather the Muslims. This shift from anti-Semitism to Islamophobia is a significant change that deserves to be analyzed. Oh, very cool. How do I ban this dude? No ideas. Like /action. Ban. I don't think it actually matters. Nice. Alright. This shift from anti-Semitism to Islamophobia is a significant change that deserves to be analyzed. This is also something I've personally noticed. I don't know. I feel like Islamophobia is extremely strong now, and it was also very strong when I was younger, and during 2015's migrant crisis and everything, but it strangely hasn't decreased at all. And yeah, I feel like anti-Semitism, especially, it's also interesting because I feel like what we would consider these post-fascist groups, call it the current Trump administration, everything else, are quite pro-Israel, pro-Jewish. Not really anti-Semitic in the classic fashion. However, they still obviously do some anti-Semitic dog whistles and hate on called George Soros and everything else. So it's a little bit maybe interesting is the wrong word, but it's noteworthy. So continuing on, fascism was strongly anti-Semitic. An anti-Semitism shaped by the entire world vision of German National Socialism and deeply affected the varieties of French radical nationalisms. It was introduced in the laws of the Italian fascist regime in 1938, and even in Spain, where the Jews had been expelled at the end of the 15th century. Franco's propaganda identified them with the Reds as both enemies of national Catholicism, What? Am I dumb? Okay. Fascism was strongly anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism shaped the entire world vision of German National Socialism and deeply affected the varieties of French radical nationalisms. It was introduced in the laws of Italian of the Italian fascist regime in 1938, and even in Spain, where the Jews had been expelled at the end of the 15th century. Franco's propaganda identified them with the Reds as both enemies of Reds ties to both, as both enemies of national Catholicism. Of course, in the first half of the 20th century, anti-Semitism was widespread almost everywhere, from the aristocrats to the bourgeois layers, where it established by symbolical boundaries, to the intelligentsia. Many of the most red writers of the 1930s did not hide their hatred of the Jews. Today, however, Muslim immigrants have replaced the Jews in a racist discourse. Racialism, a scientific doctrine based on biological theories, has been replaced by cultural prejudice that emphasizes an irreducible discrepancy between Jewish Christian Europe and the Islam world. Traditional anti-Semitism, which shaped all European nationalisms for over a century, has not disappeared. Periodic neo-Nazi attacks against synagogues and Jewish schools in both Europe and the United States prove its persistence, but has become a residual phenomena, or has transmigrated from the right to Islamic fundamentalism. As in the system of communicating vessels, pre-war anti-Semitism declined and Islamophobia increased. In fact, there is a certain continuity in this historical transfer. The post-fascist representation of the enemy reproduces the old racial paradigm, and like the former Jewish Bolshevik, the Islamic terrorist is often depicted with physical traits, stressing his otherness. I mean, I bet if we just Google this, we will find some pretty fucking horrendous comics. I mean, okay, so right now, nothing too bad. But if we... I was expecting some more like Charlie Hebdo level comics. That's good at least. Yeah. Which of course, I mean, goes without saying, that was a tragedy, but yeah. The Islamic terrorist is often depicted with physical traits stressing his otherness. In one century, the intellectual ambition of the radical right has significantly diminished. True type shit. Nowadays, there is no equivalent of The Jewish France by Edouard Durmont, or The Foundations of the 19th Century by Houston Stewart Chamberlain, nor the Essays on Racial Anthropology by Hans Gunther in 1930s. The new nationalism has not produced writers like Louis Ferdinand Céline or Pierre de La Rochelle, not to speak of philosophers like Giovanni Gentile, Martin Heidegger, and Carl Schmitt. The cultural hummus, I need to look up what this means. I just have a vibe for what this means. Okay. So Merriam-Webster says, so what's this? Oh, it's 1M. Let's see. That explains it. I was thinking of the spread, but I was like, oh yeah, it's a bunch of like mixed up, crushed up stuff. But hummus is actually the soil part. I like the undertones it brings to the sentence. The cultural humus of post-fascism is not nourished with literary creation, except perhaps Michael Houellebecq's Soumission. This is like submission, which depicts France in 2022 transformed into an Islamic republic, rather with a massive campaign to win media attention. Many political and intellectual personalities, television channels, and popular magazines that cannot be qualified as fascists have contributed to building this cultural humus. We could remember the inflamed prose of the Oriana Fallaci on the Muslims who reproduce themselves like rats and urinate. Many political and intellectual personalities, television channels, and popular magazines that cannot be qualified as fascist have contributed to building this cultural humus. Make sure I'm saying this right. Humus.
Humus.
Humus. What? Okay.
Hummus.
Okay, so it's humus. All right, humus. We could remember the inflamed prose of Oriana Fallaci on the Muslims who, quote, reproduce themselves like rats, unquote, and urinate against the walls of our cathedrals. George L. Moss has pointed out that in classical fascism, spoken words were more important than written texts. In an age in which the culture of words and images channeled by televisions and the social media has replaced textuality, it is not astonishing that the post-fascist discourse spreads first of all through the media, assigning a secondary place to literary productions, which become useful like sumisos insofar as they transformed into media events. Maybe we should look up Charles Debraw's Society of the Spectacle as a little additional reading here. We may observe many significant similarities between today's Islamophobia and fin de siècle's anti-Semitism. Fuck.
Fin de siècle.
Fin de siècle.
Fin de siècle.
Fin de siècle. Oh, it's end of century. Okay. Anti-Semitism. In a pre-fascist era, but we should distinguish between the France and Germany. After the Dreyfus Affair, French anti-Semitism stigmatized Jewish immigrants from Poland and Russia, but its main target were the senior officials, juges d'état, who under the Third Republic occupied very important positions in the bureaucracy, the army and the academic institutions, and the government. Captain Dreyfus himself was a symbol of such social ascension. At the time of the Popular Front, the target of anti-Semitism was Leon Blum, a Jewish dandy who embodied the image of a republic conquered by the anti-France. The Jews were designated as a state within a state, a position that certainly does not correspond to the present situation of the Muslim minorities that still remain hugely underrepresented inside institutions of European countries. This is also quite true. Right? Like I feel even in like when I was learning about like Nazi Germany and everything, the general trend was that the Jewish communities were quite wealthy, although like partially like are ostracized. But that's also why they were able to be like othered so easily, is that they were different, but also you could point to them and be like, hey, they're stealing your money or something. Whereas like I feel like that argument certainly does not follow with like the current demographics for like Islamic populations in Europe. I think in general they're much worse off than like the white majorities in these countries. Thus, the comparison would be more pertinent with Wilhelmine Germany, where the Jews were carefully excluded from the state machine, just as the newspapers warned against a Jewish invasion, Verjudung, that was putting into question the ethnical and religious matrix of the Reich. Anti-Semitism played the role of cultural code that allowed Germans to negatively define a national consciousness in a country torn by rapid modernization and urbanization, when the Jews appeared as its most dynamic group. In other words, a German was, first of all, non-Jewish. In a similar way, today, Islam is becoming a cultural code that allows Europeans to find, by a negative democratization, their lost national identity, threatened to engulf in the process of globalization. This is also very insightful. It's like, just in math, right? It's much easier to define the exclusion of a set than the inclusion of a set. Or maybe not purely in math, but when you have to see what's included in something, not with complete coverage, but you can just what is a human? It's a lot easier to say not a dog than to define what a human is. And I feel like, okay, so what is a European? What is a German? What is a Swede? It's a lot easier to say not X than, a Swede is actually Y. Same with Americans, right? What is an American? It's quite hard to define. You can go by citizenship, but then is someone whose parents are American and live in American culture but don't have citizenship still an American? This sort of stuff. But it's easy to say just not this group. Sometimes anti-Semitism and Islamophobia coexist in post-fascist discourses as two complementary rhetorical figures. The most striking case of this combination is found with Viktor Orban, the chief of the Hungarian government, who denounces a double threat, a financial conspiracy organized by a Jewish elite from Wall Street. The usual target of his speeches is the banker George Soros, and the demographic threat embodied by mass immigration and Islamic invasion. While less explicit than Orban, similar arguments are often suggested by other far-right leaders of Central and Western Europe. But we should not neglect the multiple contradicts of such xenophobic rhetoric. Orban, as well as Trump, Bolsonaro, and other far-right leaders, has a very good relationship with Israel, which he considers as a powerful anti-Islamic bastion, and as a useful intermediary between the Visegrad Group and the U.S. The fuck is the Visegrad? Think of Matteo Salvini, the leader of an Italian radical right, who became internationally famous when, as a Ministry of the Interior, he impeded the ONG ships of refugees from reaching the shores of Sicily. 1 month ago, over the course of just 1 week, he both participated in mass meetings against immigrants and organized a conference against anti-Semitism in Rome with the Israeli ambassador as a distinguished guest. In France, the myth of invasion was first formulated as a literary trope that quickly turned into a slogan, the Great Replacement, Le Grand Replacement, sure. The invention of this figure of speech, the Islamization of France, sure, is Renal Camus, a writer who does not hide his closeness with the National Front. 15 years ago, he complained in his journal about the overwhelming Jewish presence in the French cultural media. In the following years, he has shifted his focus to the Muslims, the actors of the Great Replacement. Camus belongs to the old-school French conservatism. His complaint about the disappearance of the eternal France has the anguished taste of Leon Bloy's pamphlets. The most popular advocates of the theory of the Great Replacement, however, are two public intellectuals, Eric Zemmour and Alain Finkielkraut. Zemmour has devoted to this topic a very successful book, 500,000 copies sold in 6 months, titled The French Suicide. Finkelierkraut is the authority of another bestseller, The Identité Malheureuse, The Unhappy Identity, in which he depicts the despair of a great nation faced by two calamities, multiculturalism and mistakenly idealized hybridity, the French melting pot, métissage of France, black, blanc, blanc, i.e. black, white, and mager brown. I'm guessing this is brown-ish. Oh, okay. A national image that became very popular after the French victory of the Football World Cup in 1998. Put in historical perspective, the myth of the Great Replacement reveals some astonishing affinities with the classic anti-Semitic stereotype. This disclosure does not differ very much from that of German nationalism at the end of the 19th century. In 1880, Heinrich von Treitschke, the most respected German historian, deplored the intrusion, Einbruch, of the Jews into German society, where they shook the customs of Kultur and acted as a corruptive element. Treitschke's, I need to look up how to pronounce this man's word. His name. Let me hear the pronunciation, please. I even know German. Treitschke. That's what I would think it would be. That doesn't help me. I'm not going to try and figure out how to fucking decode this. Maybe we just try Google Translate. Treitschkes. Okay. It is Treitschke. It's too many consonants in a row. Conclusion was a note of despair that became a kind of slogan. The Jews are the kind of slogan. The Jews are our unhappiness. Die Juden sind unser Unglück. This catchphrase was appropriated by National Socialism in the 1930s. In fact, Finkelkraut's and Treitschke's unhappiness have the same roots, a similar discontent in the face of modernization and globalization, combined with the search for a scapegoat. In the US, the equivalent of the Great Replacement is Donald Trump's slogan, America First, which, like the French homologue, it's just like an analog, but a word shared by two languages or dialects. Okay. So it's like analog equivalent. Has an interesting genealogy recently analyzed by Sarah Churchwell. Words have their own history of which even their speakers may not be conscious. Robert O. Paxton, a distinguished historian of fascism, pointed out that despite his frequent almost fascistic, oh my god. Sometimes
Fascistic.
Fascist. Fascistic.
Almost fascistic. Okay, yes. Despite his frequent almost fascistic behaviors and assessments, Donald Trump has probably never read any book on fascism. Nonetheless, his slogan is burdened with a large and heavy past. Until the First World War, America First was the mantra of isolationism. It invoked a spirit of selfishness and conviction that the national interest should be defended regardless of any external circumstances. But the Great War was a turning point. Since the early 1920s, his catchword took a different meaning. Until it's condensed the claims of a new nativism that, according to many contemporaries, expressed the features of possible American fascism, pushed forward by the anti-Bolshevik Red Scare and the rise of the KKK, which reached at that time its highest influence. America First was reinterpreted in terms of biological racism. The United States has protected itself from mass immigration and external threats coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. That was okay. Let's run that back again. The United States had to protect itself from mass immigration, an external threat coming from Southern and Eastern Europe that was modifying the biological basis of its civilization. Italian, Polish, and Balkan peasants, as well as Eastern Jews, were destroying Nordicism, a pillar of traditional, i.e. WASP, America, white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Oh yeah. White Anglo Protestants, yes, okay. Hey, do I get a cookie for that one? The U.S. equivalents of Chamberlain, Drummond, Byers, and Murras were the eugenicists Madison Grant and the author of The Passing of the Great Race, and Luthrop Stoddart's The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. Both of them announced a future of decadence for a nation that because of immigration could not remain a homogeneous population of Nordic blood. What the fuck? To me, a future of decadence. This. Is this more like decay? Deterioration. Oh my god. It's not
Decadence.
what? I think my world has been blown. But like decadent. Okay, so it's like self-indulgent, but like mostly to do with decay. I've never fully understood that, actually. I always thought it was more the self-indulgent maximalism. Both of them announced a future of decadence for a nation that, because of immigration, could not remain a homogeneous population of Nordic blood. This huge campaign resulted in the National Origins Act of 1924, enthusiastically supported by the KKK, that reduced immigration by more than 80%, by fixing the national quotas corresponding to the average of each nation in 1890, when the immigration wave from the Southern and Eastern Europe was just starting. In the age of the New Deal, this wave of racist nativism disappeared until its spectacular comeback with Donald Trump. Thus, it is not very difficult to sketch out the historical background of his speeches against Latino and Muslim immigrants. In January 2018, he shocked the public opinion when he declared that the United States should stop receiving all these people from shithole countries. Holy shit. He's the funniest man alive. Like Africa and Haiti, instead of admitting more people from places like Norway. In 2018, like in 1924, stopping immigration was a matter of life and death for America, the condition to make America great again. Oi, oi, oi.
I know he can fight as well. It's his talent. Let's see how talented he is now for this. Nice tentative start.
Just wait for it. Just wait for it. It don't want to get predictable.
Jimmy's standing tall. He's not backing off. Good low kick from Dexter. Steps out the way of the low kick. Return from Jimmy. Puts out the jab. Low kick. Solid
Both
low
men
kick.
just trading low kicks.
Just measure. Solid.
Okay. That was my quick little intermission, and now back to our reading. What is this? 20... yeah. 25% of the way done. Let's go from here. The return of the colonial repressed. Islamophobia, however, is not a simple ersatz for the old anti-Semitism, insofar as its roots are old and it possesses its own tradition, which is colonialism. In Europe, colonialism had invented a political anthropology based on the dichotomy between citizens and colonial subjects. In the French, the legal categories of citoyens and indigènes, indigenous and citizens, that fix social, spatial, and racial and political boundaries. The colonial matrix of Islamophobia gives us a key for understanding the ideological metaphosis of post-fascism. What the fuck does this mean? Motherfuckers using all these big words. It's a poem? Sounds like legendary poems of post-fascism, which has abandoned the imperial and conquering ambitions of classical fascism in order to adopt a much more conservative and defensive posture. It does not wish to conquer, rather to expel, even to the point of criticizing the neo-imperial wars carried on since the beginning of the 1990s by the US and its Western allies. Whereas 19th century colonialism wished to accomplish its civilizing mission by seizing and appropriating territories outside of Europe, post-colonial Islamophobia fights against an interior enemy in the name of the same values. Rejection replaced occupation, but their motivations did not change. In the past, conquest aimed to subjugate and civilize. Today, expulsion aims to protect civilization. This explains the recurring debates on secularism and the Islamic veil, especially in France, that led to Islamophobic laws prohibiting it in public places. This consensual agreement on neo-colonial and discriminatory conception of secularism has significantly contributed to the legitimization of post-fascism in the public sphere. I pointed out on the neoconservative character of post-fascism, but this tendency is shaped by many contradictions and should not be interpreted as a return to Joseph de Maistre. Emerging from within a consolidated political tradition of liberal democracy and an anthropological model of possessive individualism built by market societies, post-fascism has broken with the fascist ideal type, and in many cases claims the legacy of enlightenment. In the post-totalitarian age of human rights, this gives it respectability. Classical colonialism had taken place in the name of progress and universalism. This is the tradition which post-fascism tries to merge. It does not justify its war against Islam with the old and today no longer receivable arguments of doctrinal racism, rather with the philosophy of human rights. Marine Le Pen, who has clearly distanced herself from her father on this issue, does not wish to defend exclusively the native French against immigrants. She wishes to defend also women against Islamic obscurantism. Homophobia and gay-friendly Islamophobia coexist in this changing radical right. In the Netherlands, feminism and gay rights have been the flags of violent xenophobic campaign against immigration and the Muslims, carried out first by Pim Fortuyn and then by his successor Geert Wilders. Elites. The last significant difference between the classical fascism and post-fascism lies in the position of the global elites. In the 1930s, the fear of communism pushed them to accept Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco. As several historians have pointed out, such dictators certainly benefited from the many miscalculations made by statesmen and the traditional conservative parties, but there is no doubt that without the threat of the Russian Revolution and World Depression, in the middle of the collapsing Weimar Republic, Germany's economic, military, and political elites would not allowed Hitler to take power. They despised Hitler because of his plebeian origins, his fanaticism, and his hysterical style, more than for his racism or anti-Semitism. But they preferred him to the Bolshevism and were ready to welcome him as a providential man in front of the threat of a new Spartacist revolution. Today, toute proportion garde, something similar. What the fuck does this mean? Old man struggles to read French. En anglais, s'il vous plaît, bitte. All things considered. Thank you. Today, all things considered. Motherfuckers. Something similar could happen in the American elections. The global elites are neither protectionist nor interested in stopping immigration, and don't share Trump's culture or style. But unlike in 2016, when they supported Hillary Clinton, this time they would probably endorse Donald Trump against Bernie Sanders. In Europe, the situation is different. There, the interests of the economic elites are much better represented by the European Union than by the radical right. The latter could become a credible interlocutor. It's like, let's figure out what the fuck it means. Interlocutor. See dictionary. Person. Okay, someone who's taking a part in the dialogue. And a potential leader only in the case of a collapse of the entire euro that would push the continent into a situation of chaos and instability. Unfortunately, we cannot exclude such a possibility. The European Union elites remind the sleepwalkers at the edge of of 1914, the holders of the European concert, who went to the catastrophe completely unaware of what was happening. During the interwar years, the liberal democracies looked at the rise of fascism with an ambiguous attitude made of a mix of incomprehension and complacency, whose major expressions were the non-intervention of France and the UK during the Spanish Civil War and their concessions to Hitler at the Munich Conference in 1938. A similar ambiguity seems to be repeating itself today, with many episodes of collusion between the radical right and the traditional right in several countries from southern and central Europe. In the European Parliament, the followers of Viktor Orban are allied with those of Angela Merkel and Thuringia. Just a few days ago, the CDU and AfD allied against the left before being disavowed by Merkel herself. These episodes confirm that the post-fascism is an unstable constellation and may change in the future. But until now, the radical right has grounded its legitimacy in its rejection of neoliberalism. The global elites are cosmopolitan. They embody a form of economically and culturally post-national universalism that, as Wolfgang Streeck pertinently points out, has engendered by reaction a form of elitist nationalism from below. Post-fascism was able to give a political expression to this fearful resentment. The roots of today's radical right-wing movement are old, but their rise was fueled by economic crises that has dramatically revealed the symbiotic relationship between political elites and the financial elites. Since the 1990s, i.e. since the end of the Cold War, both left and right governments forces have embraced neoliberalism as a kind of pensée unique. The pensée unique en anglais, s'il vous plaît. Here we go. Single thought. Okay. This is the main premise of the spectacular increase of the far right, which has finally appeared as an alternative. Thus, I fear that the defense of the establishment is not the answer to post-fascism, just as elites of the 1930s were unable to stop the rise of fascism. The radical right, one could say, is the undemocratic answer to the process of undoing democracy, carried out by neoliberal reason. In a famous aphorism of 1939, Marx Horkheimer wrote that if you don't want to talk about capitalism, then you should be silent about fascism. Today, one could say, if you don't wish to talk about neoliberalism, you should be silent about post-fascism. Damn, I should highlight this. That doesn't work. Populism. Considering the significant differences between historical fascism and its epigons, which I mentioned above, some scholars suggest to depict the latter as populist. Populism, they argue, is a new correlation of charismatic leadership, political authoritarianism, rejection of pluralism, ethnic nationalism, mythical views of sovereignty, xenophobia, and racism, often translated into discriminatory laws. We can agree with this definition. In the public discourse, however, populism is too often a source of confusion and misunderstandings. Today, it is weaponized by the elites themselves as a kind of immunizing tool, since there is no alternative to neoliberal reason. All of its critics are automatically stigmatized as populists. A similar way, during the Cold War, the term totalitarianism was used in order to immunize the so-called free world. Communism was interchangeable with fascism, and all the critics of market society and liberal democracy were totalitarian enemies. If populism is a rhetorical dispositive that consists in opposing the virtues embodied by mythical people to the corrupted elites, there is no doubt that most contemporary far-right movements are populist. Such a definition, however, simply describes their political style without grasping their content, and this content can be very different. In Latin America, for instance, there is a long history of left-wing populism that used demagogy and often, particularly in recent times, took authoritarian features, but its goal was primarily to include the lower classes into this social and political system by assuring them some fundamental rights. In Western Europe, right-wing populism is xenophobic, racist, and claims policies of exclusion. Since the 19th century, we have experienced a Russia and American populism, a great variety of Latin American populisms, and a right-wing and left-wing populism. Now, if populism means that Donald Trump is interchangeable with Bernie Sanders, Podemos with Vox, Marine Le Pen with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and Eva Morales with Jair Bolsonaro, I think it becomes a useless concept. Populism is a chameleonic word. When the adjective is transformed into substantive, its heuristic value dramatically drops. Very often, populism is a word that reveals the contempt for the people by those using it in order to disqualify their adversaries. This is why I think post-fascism is a more pertinent definition. In conclusion, considering fascism as a transhistorical concept does not mean to posit its eternal character or envisage its repetition. In the 21st century, it cannot appear but under a new guise, and as I indicated at the beginning of my talk, we probably will need new words to depict it. If fascism is transhistorical, it is first of all because it's much more than a simple historiographical object. It's also a realm of memory, and as such, it affects our present and our political imagination. Commemorating the Holocaust is useless if it does not help us to struggle against the racism of the present. Studying fascism would be similarly pointless if it does not instill into us the consciousness that democracies are fragile conquests, and that sometimes they implode, and that the history of the 20th century is also the history of their disintegration. Well, that was Post-Fascism, Fascism as a Transhistorical Concept. I really enjoyed reading this. No one enjoyed watching this other than myself, but that's okay. Again, trying to use these live streams mostly as just like motivation for myself to maybe do some interesting reading, or I don't know, play some fun games with my friends. But kind of the concept of people potentially watching me kind of keeps me on track and lets me achieve these goals. So whether you watch or not, thank you and have a good day, and yeah, adios.